So thank you, Teresa, for the kind introduction, and also I'd like to thank the organizers and also the production team who are doing a great job today and yesterday and in the past 2 days. So basically I'm here to talk about protein and really put some context into certain nutrients and the requirements and how these can actually contribute to a healthy breakfast. And what I want to touch on is just a few points and specific points. So when we talk about is breakfast important, it is, but for what? So in the first instance, we have this outline I want to share with you. I want to break my talk down into certain points. So we have the importance of dietary proteins, why they're important and what they actually are. Then we have the diurnal protein turnover concept, which is quite important in what I'm going to be talking about. Dietary protein in children, what knowledge we have, protein at breakfast, and then just conclude. So why do we actually want to talk about protein and breakfast? Well, we have what we describe here as this life course and health across the life course. And it's actually dictated by several different points throughout the lifespan. So if we follow the blue line, that's the ideal kind of process we have with birth through to aging. But in actual fact, what we see a lot of the time is this red line occurring. So what we want to do is try and prevent that big decline towards the end and towards the aging process, which is something I also work on quite a bit. And one way to do that is just address health and nutrition and lifestyle early on in life so we don't have this big dip at the end. Now the problem is kids are very plastic and there's very little research out there in healthy kids. So what do kids need for breakfast? Well, they're plastic, they can adapt, they don't really have any specific requirements per se as long as they have some sort of breakfast. The problem is that as we age, this accumulation of behaviors, good or bad, get more and they have more of an impact. So although we reduce the plasticity in our health and in our metabolic flexibility, we actually add a lot more insult to it through either good or bad behaviors. So starting off with what proteins are and what their purpose is, we see here we've got several different areas of physiology and biochemistry where proteins can actually have an impact. So we see anything covering from enzymes, biochemical signaling, hormones and neurotransmitters. It's also a source of energy. So just saying consume as much protein as you like, you'll never put on any weight is a huge misconception. They're also involved in transport of oxygen, transferring iron, the immunity system, growth and maintenance, which is where I'm going to touch on today, and then just put it into a context of breakfast. Now, protein is a very complex molecule, and we have it in a lot of foods. We fortify foods with protein. We have protein supplements. The problem is, protein is very, very different depending on what source, what kind of physicochemical properties you have, and also the environmental factors. So age, for instance, total diet, physical activity, are we physically active or sedentary? That can significantly change the protein requirements. The quantity we eat, the timing, which was addressed before, this chrononutrition concept, I'll touch on that a little bit. And then the short and long-term effect. And there's a lot of research out there communicating on the huge benefits of protein that are based on 3-hour studies. So what a lot of the scientific community is trying to do now is put this into context of a long-term period. And by long-term, let me get that clear, we're not on about years. It's very difficult to do clinical trials that last years. We use observational studies for that, but we try and do studies that last a couple of months. The next aspect is this physicochemical factor that influences how protein is digested, absorbed, and ultimately its physiological and biological response. For instance, the composition, what protein are we talking about? What types of proteins? The quality, which is also dictated by the source. Its mineral content, are you adding minerals to your food? The structure, the interaction with other components, and of course the processing. So we know that heating obviously changes the structures of protein. And I recently found out that if you have a steak, for instance, at 90 degrees, it's less digestible than if it's cooked at 60 degrees. So these are very important components. So it's not just as simple as saying this is how much protein you require. You then have to see what's the matrix you're actually eating it in and what's the timing that you're consuming it at. So as an example, this is a study that was a clinical trial performed in children, 8-year-old children. And just as a summary, cow's milk provides about 7 grams of protein per glass. And of that 7 grams of protein, 80% is casein and 20% is whey. And what we find, and what this study nicely showed, is that depending on the physiological outcome, casein and whey impact it differently. For instance, in the top blue square, we have IGF-1, and that is where casein really interacts and really stimulates growth through IGF stimulation. On the other hand, whey had no impact on IGF, but it actually had an impact on insulin. So it has quite a high amount of insulinogenic amino acids, and these amino acids are able to stimulate this insulin response. Now, of course, once you start looking at different plant proteins, you also start getting different physiological responses there. But this is just an indicative slide to show you that different proteins have different physiological responses. So not all proteins are created equally, therefore. So this is a nice study here which compared whey, soy, and casein. And we have the essential amino acid profile, and we also see that you have a different digestion rate between the different types of proteins. So if you want something quick, a quick digestion and absorption of amino acids, whey seems to be the best one. Soy is an in-between, and casein seems to be very slowly digested. And sometimes it can take up to 6, 7, 8 hours even, depending on the time of day you consume your protein, to actually get a full uptake of these amino acids. So therefore, milk proteins are high-quality proteins, we know that, as is soy in this instance. But the digestion rate differs quite significantly. So we call whey a quick protein and casein a low. And the rate and magnitude of the amino acid appearance in the blood following protein intake depends upon the type of protein. So again, what benefit do you want? There's a lot of talk around giving casein before bed to sustain the amino acid supplementation to the system through the night. So whey protein intake compared to constituent amino acids on muscle protein synthesis. What do we see here? Aristotle once said that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and really that's what we see in this nice clinical trial here. This has also been repeated in other animal models as well as humans. So what we see here is that on the top, you have the whey protein plasma insulin response. It's peaking quite normally as it does. But then what we see is that if you break that amino acid, the whey protein component down to its constituent amino acids, and you feed those amino acids, you start getting different responses, which means it's not just the case of the amino acid content in the protein that drives the biological response. There's other things within the protein. There's peptides, there's bioactives, there's lots of nutritional, pro-nutritional, anti-nutritional factors as well that are tied to the protein. So here, this kind of shows you the change in muscle protein synthesis. So this is the rate at which your muscle is being synthesized in the leg. And you see whey protein on the left, the essential amino acids and the non-essential amino acids. And the amino acid component here is the exact same amount of amino acids that you find in that whey protein that they gave. So it's just the constituents, but just given as free amino acids instead of the whole protein. So basically what I'm trying to show you with this slide is that the biological response will differ significantly. Now, are you giving what type of protein? Are you giving it as free amino acids, or are you giving it as a protein content on the whole? So therefore, if you want to target a breakfast approach, you want to target clinical nutrition, you can really play around with the type of protein you give and the mode that protein is delivered in. So diurnal protein turnover, how can protein regulate, and what's the role of protein in regulating lean mass or muscle mass or anything like that? Well, we have this concept of protein balance, which has been described quite extensively over the last 20, 30 years. And what we see is that on a given day, you eat a meal, that releases the amino acids, they get taken up by the gut, enter the plasma, and then these get delivered to all the lean tissues, including muscle. This is just a diagram depicting the muscle because it's easier to draw than anything else. But really what we see is that you have the free amino acids, they enter the muscle, but at the same time you have a concomitant degradation of the muscle. So you get a release of these proteins, these amino acids in the form of amino acids. So when that is actually in balance, you find that you have a maintenance of growth or of muscle mass. When you actually have a shift in the synthesis, you can accrue protein. Obviously, when you have an increase in the breakdown in certain diseases or after prolonged fasting, you can actually get a loss of muscle mass. And this is what I'll be showing you later on in the children. Now, different factors can influence this turnover. So we have nutrition, we have the physical activity, hormones, genetics, and the biological age, which all impact this quite significantly. And in the context of nutrition, what we really want to focus on is protein. Protein has actually been studied extensively in this context. So if I just put protein turnover in numbers, and it's not just a concept, it can actually be measured, it has been measured. And what we have for a 70 kilogram person, they're made up of around 12 kilograms of protein. And then there's around 2 to 230 grams of free amino acids at any point. At the whole body level, protein turnover is around 300 grams per day. And in terms of skeletal muscle, you have about 40-45% of the skeletal muscle is of total body mass and contains 7 grams of protein, primarily in the form of contractile protein. So these are the proteins that actually make your muscles contract. Now, what's nice is that in about 3 months from now, all the muscle in your body, all the proteins will have been disposed of, and you'll have new ones in there. So your muscles will be completely renewed in about 3 months. This is quite a slow turnover rate when you look at it compared to other organs in the body, such as the liver and the gut, which ranges between 10 and 20%. Now, I had a great discussion yesterday with a colleague about protein supplementation and exercise and all this, and also in the energy content of food and how that complements these things. The body is very efficient, and it can actually recycle itself, so it breaks itself down. The free amino acids can then be reabsorbed, taken back up and used for muscle protein synthesis and other functions. And on average, we have a recycling process of around 9 times. So how does nutrition actually regulate this extensively? So this is some work we did 10 years ago now, and basically what it's showing, it seems like a complex graph, but it was a very controlled situation. We brought subjects into the laboratory first thing in the morning in a fasted state. You infuse a label, a trace amino acid, and at the same time, just after that, you take a biopsy from the muscle. Then you start infusing amino acids, and that's what we had here throughout the 3-hour period. And we infused quite a high level of amino acids. And what you find in the post-absorptive state on the left, you have protein breakdown in the hash bar, in the stripes, which is quite high. Synthesis in the speckle bar is lower, and therefore you're in a negative state. So you're actually losing more muscle than you're actually building when you're fasted in the morning. Once you start providing amino acids, you see that synthesis is doubled. So we know that amino acids stimulate this through specific molecular pathways. So overall, your balance comes into a positive phase. And then what we see is that you start increasing the insulin availability through insulin clamps. It's not a food that we're giving, we're actually infusing insulin. You start seeing that it actually has an impact on the breakdown. So when you have a food that contains carbohydrate and protein, you impact both breakdown and synthesis. But as I showed you earlier on, whey can also have an impact on the insulin response. It's not as great as carbohydrate, of course, but you can still impact the breakdown process as well as the synthetic, depending on what protein you choose to give. So insulin secretion results in the attenuation of protein breakdown on the one hand, while on the other, amino acids result in a stimulation of synthesis. Now, this is done in adults. It's impossible to take biopsies from healthy kids, as you may understand. So the research is very scarce, which is why I'm going through a lot of the adult literature here to start off with. So although I've shown you acutely what happens in terms of muscle protein synthesis and breakdown on the turnover, what I really want to show you now is this is a hypothetical schema which shows you how it might fluctuate throughout the day. So we sleep. Everyone sleeps unless you're jet lagged and you're talking the next morning, which can impact sleep. But really what happens is you're not having any food. So what will happen there is your body starts breaking itself down to produce substrate, which can then produce glucose and keep the rest of the systems working. Then what happens is, if you have your breakfast, you come into this positive state to a certain extent, because it depends on how much breakfast you have, and that can have a load on the insulin and the metabolic responses. But then if you don't have any snack, you come at lunchtime and you're in this slightly negative phase, you then tend to have a higher lunch, more lunch intake than what you do at breakfast, causing a stimulation again, and then at dinner time, you have a big peak because people tend to eat more dinner than any other time of the day. And then you re-enter this sleep process. So what do we know? How much protein can stimulate muscle protein synthesis? And what's the maximal amount of protein synthesis you can get in muscle? So this is a study carried out several years ago now. And this was looking at egg protein, the impact of egg protein on muscle protein synthesis. So what they found is they actually gave different loads of protein, ranging between 5, 10, 20, and 40 grams of protein. And this was done after physical activity in healthy young adults. And what you find is that anything beyond 20 grams of protein saturates the synthetic response. So if I take 40 grams of protein, I'm not getting any more benefit than what I would get by consuming 20 or 25. So 25 grams is what's been defined as the golden point, the break point. What I'm not showing you in this graph, though, is that the extra protein gets oxidized. And when it gets oxidized, it has different metabolic fates. One of the fates can be that it can eventually get stored as fat, what remnants you have. Of course, the majority can be excreted in the urine and the feces, but you can get storage of fat from this. So what happens in a fasted state? And was this a one-off study? Well, no. I've superimposed some other data here from another group. In the white bars, you have a sedentary state, so the adults have come in, the individuals have come in, the subjects, they're fasted, and then they gave them graded amounts of protein. And you see again, you have a lower synthetic response compared to if you proceed it with exercise, but nonetheless, you still get that break point of around 20-25 grams. Now, this is specific for muscle protein synthesis, and I'm not talking about whole body protein synthesis here. So 25 grams, and a lot of people who perform sport have probably heard that 20-25 grams is important to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and this is really the literature that's responsible for those claims. So coming back to the distribution, so now we've seen data on how much protein to have in a single dose, but does it matter how you distribute your protein? So this is a very nice study that was done by Mamero et al. And Donald Lehman. And what they actually looked at is, they said, all right, if we provide 90 grams of protein in a given day, that's give or take what an individual will consume, does it matter how I distribute that protein throughout the day on muscle protein synthesis? So what they did here is you have the even distribution, which was 30 grams, 30 grams, 30 grams, and then the skewed, which was 10 for breakfast, 15 for lunch, and 65 grams for dinner. And what you actually find is that by maintaining this diet for 7 days, they do it on day one, they assess the muscle protein synthesis on day one, and then repeated the measurement on day 7, and you find that an even distribution has higher impact on muscle protein synthesis than skewed protein distribution. Now, we don't have any data supporting this in kids, and this is it's about 3 or 4 studies looking at this protein timing and distribution. It depends if you're exercising, if you're not, so there's no clear recommendation, but what is clear is that it can impact your physiology and the metabolic response. So what do we know about dietary protein in children? Well, not a lot. There's some recommendations from the WHO, and what I want you to do is read this. Basically, it's an extract I've copy-pasted from a consensus from the WHO in 2007. And it's basically depicting and defining what a dietary protein requirement should be. It must provide for maintenance and any special needs of growth. And in kids, we have that. The protein requirement can be defined as the lowest level of dietary protein. So we're not looking at saturating any system here. We're not looking at optimal. We're just looking at the minimum amounts of protein that are required to give you a positive protein balance. Okay? Now, when you look at this, the actual values are not defined very well. The values are defined well, but the way they've gone about it isn't that great. You can't take muscle biopsies. There's certain methodologies which are a little bit outdated, so there is a lot more work coming out on defining amino acid and protein requirements in children today. But the current WHO values are set at 0.75 grams per kilogram body weight. Now, when we talk about recommendations, we don't normally talk in milligrams per kilogram or anything like that. We normally talk about 20 grams, 15 grams, or % of your energy, which is a bit confusing for lay individuals. So how do people actually eat their protein? So we know how much can stimulate muscle protein synthesis in adults, but what do we know in children? So this is some work that was carried out from the kids study. And what we find is that the majority of the protein on a given day in the US, across the age groups of childhood, is consumed in the evening. Now, we went and we defined what we perceived as morning, lunch, and the evening, but of course this is open to interpretation, but for this purpose, we had it, breakfast was up till 10 o'clock. So what we find is that we have 3 different age groups here. We have 4 to 8, 9 to 13, and 14 to 18 years of age. And we have a very similar trend and pattern across the age groups. So very little at breakfast, more at lunch, and even more at dinner. Now, on the right-hand side of that graph there, what you see is the total protein intake that these individuals are consuming. Now, bear in mind that WHO recommends children consume 0.75 grams. These blue squares are where they should be, and in fact, you see that they're consuming between 200% and 300% more than they should be on any given day. So, on the day of the measurement, in this instance, daily protein intake was higher than the recommendations, as I've already highlighted. 54% of the children had the most protein in the evening, and 60% of children distributed their protein intake in this manner. Now, we don't know if this is good, if you distribute your protein like that. Should it be distributed in an even manner, based on the adult data I showed you before? Or should it be, back to what my grandma said, eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper? We don't know. And does it have any impact? So, based on those data I've just shown you that there's a high protein consumption, does it actually matter? Does it, if they overconsume protein? Well, we have some data coming out. It's currently under review. And there is evidence from infants that high protein intake is not good. It leads to increased adiposity. But we don't know the relationships, associations, or any clinical trials in older children to see if this kind of effect is maintained. So from the Generation R cohort in Rotterdam, we actually saw that, yes, high protein intake is linked to higher incidence of adiposity in older children. So what they ate at the age of 8 and the outcomes in terms of BMI and DEXA scans at the age of 10. And however, what we find is that the increase in weight that we also saw was explained by greater lean mass. Although the kids are getting heavier, more overweight and obese, we do actually see that they do have a higher lean tissue mass. And what we find is that there's a greater relationship between plant protein intake and greater lean mass in these kids. But this is, again, it's an observational study. It's very hard to define that it's a true protein impact, because in an observational study you have a mixed meal. You're not controlling what the individuals are eating. So is there a key time to consume your protein? Well, it depends, again, right? What occasion are we talking? Is it a snack at school? Is it after physical activity? So we actually published this paper last year where we measured a graded protein intake in children, and we wanted to see the impact on whole body protein balance. And what we found is that 5 grams of protein between 5 and 10 actually brings into a positive balance after physical activity. Physical activity on its own actually induces an increased breakdown. So exercise causes high breakdown, and then you need the nutrition to recover any losses you've had and come back stronger. So what we did in this study as well, we looked at the timing of protein intake after physical activity. And what we did is we distributed the 15 grams evenly or skewed with a 4-hour gap. So the kids performed their physical activity, and then they either consumed the 0, 5, 10, or 15 grams of protein. And the kid that had 0 grams straight after exercise consumed 15 grams 4 hours after exercise. So then you can see how the distribution of protein changes, and you actually get greater whole body protein balance when you have a more even distribution of your protein 4 hours after exercise in that 4-hour window. And what this gives us is it gives us an indication that the distribution, again, can impact the outcome of whole body protein balance. So the next point I really want to address is dietary protein at breakfast, and is it important or is it not? Well, it depends, again, what outcome we're looking at. There's this work which was done by Heather Leedy. She's done quite a bit of work on the breakfast occasion. This was done in overweight and obese females in adolescent age, and this was looking really at satiety, so hunger, sensations, food intake, and that kind of outcome there. And what she actually did is she had breakfast skippers, and she kept one group breakfast skipping for 7 days. Second group, they provided 13 grams of protein, which is just the third line from above. And the third group consumed very high amounts of protein, which was in the range of 35 grams. And what they found when they actually assessed their intake over the whole kind of day over 10 hours is depicted on the right-hand side. You see that breakfast skipping had a higher sensation of hunger over the 10 hours, but there wasn't any difference between the normal protein intake and the high protein intake. So it's very difficult to say that this is protein-driven. There is some evidence out there that protein can impact your hunger feelings, but it's far from clear. So the outcomes here was breakfast led to beneficial alterations in the appetite, hormonal and neural signals. High protein reduced late night high fat snacking, which is quite an important thing. However, the outcome didn't really change. So you can get someone to eat less snacks or they feel less hungry, but the whole calorie intake was the same across the day. So it's very difficult to say that having a high protein intake at breakfast can actually help you lose weight. So how do we identify nutritional need states at breakfast? In my case, what I'm interested in is looking at this accrual of lean tissue. And one way of doing that is through the nitrogen balance technique. So we know this is just basically the same way of presenting what I've already shown you, which is showing this balance throughout the day. And we know that in the red line, that's the breakdown. When you enter the fed state, that breakdown is reduced, as I showed you before. And then once you go into your fasted state, the breakdown is increased. Now, you can increase that by giving protein or giving exercise at certain times of the day. And the time I want to focus on is this crossing here, where you've been fasted overnight and you come into the breakfast occasion. Does breakfast impact whole body protein balance in children? Now, we know we sleep when we go into this negative state, but as I showed you from the adult literature, if you have anything more than 25 grams, that extra protein is wasted, right? So there's a maximal impact you can have. So if kids do skip breakfast, and this is true for adults as well, but if they do skip breakfast and you wait till lunch time to actually take your protein intake, can you just say, well, I missed breakfast, I'll have 40 grams of protein at lunch, that should recover anything I've lost and give me a growth requirement above the baseline? We don't know. We don't know if that is the case in children. So what makes sense is identifying how much protein is required at breakfast, which is palatable and also tasty, and what is that minimum amount to give to children at breakfast to bring them into the positive state. So this is a clinical trial we recently performed. It may look a bit complex, but basically what we did is we provided the oral glycine tracer at breakfast with graded amounts of protein, which I'll show you in a minute how much we gave. And then you basically collect the urine for 10 hours. And what we had to do here is give a controlled lunch. So the data you will see actually has is slightly impacted by the lunch intake. But due to this methodology, the impact of the lunch will be very minimal because the lunch doesn't have enough time to be incorporated into the data, into the lean tissue. It's not that sensitive. You can't start defining hourly rates. So what you do here is you look at the whole 10-hour window. Then what we did is we let the kids go home and we carried on collecting the urine for the next 12 hours or so. So we have the 10-hour window, which is the impact of the breakfast, and I'll also show you the distribution of protein through the day and how that impacted whole body protein balance. So what we have here, these are the groups I outlined. We had 0, 7, 14, and 21 grams of protein intake. And in order to make the protein tasty, because it on its own doesn't taste very nice, we added some sugar. Now, the sugar was added there in terms of form of carbohydrate in order to actually give an insulin response as well. So we know, like I showed you the data earlier on, that carbohydrate does impact the insulin response, and that's what we did here. So what we find is that, yes, when a child wakes up in the morning, you have the whole body protein synthesis in the white bar, but you see the breakdown is actually greater than the synthetic response. So overall, the kids are in a negative state. And they're losing about 63 milligrams per kilogram per hour of protein. So what happens if you just give carbohydrate in the absence of protein? Well, you see they come very close to 0. So this is the insulin response. Although we didn't measure insulin in the kids, it was a bit too invasive for this specific clinical trial, we do know that insulin is released by carbohydrate ingestion and can impact the breakdown. And that's actually what we see there. There's a reduction in the breakdown. It doesn't impact synthesis, though. So next thing we did is we gave the graded amounts of protein, and you see that what it actually doesn't impact the breakdown per se, but it starts stimulating synthesis. So overall, you get this you start recovering the protein you've lost overnight. Now this is 10 hours, so this doesn't include the evening meal, but what you do see is this, it's about 63 milligrams that you actually recover. So you recover what you've lost over an overnight sleep. So putting it into context, children lose around 23 grams of total protein from their overnight fasts. So around 7 grams of milk protein, because this is what we gave here at breakfast, is sufficient to stop the observed losses. And then, of course, if you start increasing the intake. But what we're not advocating here, I'm not saying at any point you should be consuming 21 grams of protein at breakfast. You need to start introducing that. So if breakfast skippers are not having any, then maybe it's a really good time to have it. Now, obviously, if you skip breakfast once, twice, it doesn't mean your growth is stunted, because children don't grow on a minute-by-minute basis, right? So we have periods through time. So my child, if she doesn't have an appetite for breakfast, I don't force-feed her to make sure she has it. So what happens over the whole 24-hour period? Because we don't, this is what I mean about short-term studies. 10 hours is great, and that's, it kind of gives you an indication of what the protein intake at breakfast does, but we live to 24-hour rhythms. So what we did here, because of the nature of the study that we had graded intakes of protein at breakfast, we had to balance that protein intake out across the day for ethical approval, of course. So the kids ended up eating their protein like I've depicted on the right there. So 0 grams of protein at breakfast. They all had 19 grams at lunch to try and balance that out so it didn't compromise the data I showed you on the previous slide. And then dinner was shifted from 41 grams to 21 grams. Now, the way that I showed you that most people eat in North America is more like Group B, 7, 19, and 33. So if I just zoom in to this data a little bit here, this is the actual total balance. And what we see is that there is an impact on whole body protein balance depending on how you distribute your protein throughout the day. Now, I must say this was a secondary outcome. It was nice to have simply because the study was set up like it was. And further research is definitely required to see if this is actually physiologically meaningful, right? So this is a 24-hour study. If we repeated this for, say, 3 months, would we see an increase in lean tissue accrual compared to the fat tissue? So in summary of what I've already shown you, children lose about 20-25 grams of protein during an overnight fast. The ingestion of protein is important as it attenuates these losses. Total daily protein intake and distribution seems to impact the whole body protein balance. And the protein at breakfast may reduce partly these hunger sensations in the morning. So just to conclude on what I've just basically told you and what the message is that I think you should take home is that yes, protein is important for breakfast. It has a specific physiological effect that we have measured in this specific study. But is it the be-all and end-all? Well, I don't know. What are you trying to achieve by consuming your breakfast? And this is really what we have to be clear on when we ask questions of, is protein important? For whole body turnover, protein turnover, tissue accrual, I would say yes, it's an important macronutrient to consume. Then breakfast is a key moment where you can take this protein intake. You've had a prolonged fast. Depending on the country, you can be anything from 14 hours of sleep as a child to 10 hours. So it is quite an extended period of time, especially when kids do have quite a quick turnover. So providing this protein is quite important at breakfast before you wait for lunch. Problem is overall children consume a lot of protein in the developed countries. And although no upper limit currently is set, excessive protein intake can and may, is linked to adiposity and obesogenic phenotypes. But the problem is that further long-term trials are required. We don't have that currently. We're trying to establish these, but kids are very difficult to work with. And when you start prodding them with needles, and that makes it even worse. So, but it's definitely needs to be looked at. And we also need to start looking at types of protein, how the type of protein can impact this, the amount, the distribution, and how that can look at different phases through childhood. And on that's my final slide with the acknowledgements. We've worked quite a bit with McMaster University, University of Toronto, and Erasmus. And of course, there's a vast team at the NRC which we've worked with on bringing all this to fruition. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Karagounis, for that nice presentation on the impact of protein, especially during breakfast, and looking into certain considerations on how we can further improve it. The presentation is now open. Dr. Jaya.
Hi, I think your presentation brings into sharp focus the importance to revisit the protein story, which I think has got a bit of a lull in the past few years. But I think my question to you for comment is that, as you know, much of our protein and amino acid requirements for children in particular are based on maintenance requirements and the requirements for growth. Now, that is three-dimensional growth. But there's increasing evidence that particularly in children, the amino acid requirements, the protein requirements for linear height growth may be quite different. And I think that's a very important question because much of our RDAs are based not on linear growth, but on 3D growth. Your comment?
It's very difficult to measure linear growth over time to define amino acid requirements. There's so many factors that impact it. Genetics is the main thing, right? So you can say, well, I'm not getting enough protein. Energy, as you showed yesterday, is a very important component of linear growth as well. So I think it's a very valid point. I would love to do that, but to do a clinical intervention where you start looking at requirements and doing it over 16 years is going to be very, very challenging. But I think we need to find alternative ways to assess that.
Thanks a lot for this great presentation. I have a question related to the protein source, because it seems you based results a lot on milk proteins, which also other researchers do.
Yep.
Now we're knowing there's increasing evidence that insect protein and alg protein, in case of plant protein, is increasing. And I'm wondering, what would you, if you not have done it, conclude from your study, the beneficial effect? Because I think it's very important also to focus on that and perhaps also have it as an alternative in breakfast.
Sure. In kids, it hasn't been done. There's been a lot of work on plant proteins in adults, especially after physical activity. That's the main area of interest. But in the studies that have compared whey, casein, and soy, for instance, what you do find is if you do a 3-hour window, a 3-hour study where you have the individual there and you biopsy them 3 hours apart, whey is always better because it's a fast protein, so what you get is the fast absorption. If you start extending that window, and depending on the outcome, you're looking at whole body or muscle, soy protein is going to be very similar to casein and also to whey protein. A study just came out, I think, last week or the week before, looking at insect protein. It wasn't controlled extensively, but what they found is that insect protein didn't have the same impact over time. This was a longer-term trial as what we know from the literature to be linked to whey protein. So this work needs to be done, and it's not. We gave it in a milk drink, in essence, but as I showed at the beginning, it's going to differ if you give it as part of a meal, if you're going to give it in raw form or cooked form. So these are important things. So the limitation here is we can't suddenly put that across for all proteins, and we have to look at that, but it's difficult getting the funding for each individual process.
It's related to this topic. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. It's about the Generation R study and the data that you presented. Can you really infer causality?
No.
Okay. And then the other question, so you said that increase in BMI was not related to vegetable protein consumption, but I was wondering whether this consumption was high. I mean, what was the level of consumption of these types of protein in this group of children?
The vegetable protein, I can't tell you off the top of my head. It was the majority was definitely for the animal and the dairy products, and it was definitely less, but the exact value I can't give you. So yeah.
Hi, Leonidas. It's a great talk. It's a very interesting topic. I have a question about the amount of protein. And during your presentation, you mentioned that the 25 grams actually is the maximum you can get. The more you get actually is wasted. And the WHO recommendation you said is 0.75 grams per kilogram. And if you make up that, this is the minimum recommendation from WHO. Then if you make a little calculation, you will find actually this amount is not that minimal. So this is like 50 grams for adults, like 70 or 75 kilograms. So that actually is pretty high compared to your experiments.
Yep. So
So why that is the minimal requirement from, let's say, recommendation from WHO? Why not just...
So again, the 25 grams is for optimal stimulation. All right. The WHO tends to say what the minimal amount is required to maintain or to promote growth. So the 25 grams was actually the maximal amount in adults after physical activity. But it wasn't for whole body protein, that's specifically for muscle. When you start looking at whole body protein in adults, it's a linear relation like we showed in the kids. And that's because you have a great turnover of the gut, for instance, the liver proteins, all these are turned over very rapidly. So the problem is also when you look at synthesis alone, like it was done in that study, you're not taking into consideration the breakdown. And we have to always remember that to measure breakdown in such an invasive way is actually it's extremely invasive, it goes beyond the biopsies. So it's a very difficult technique. So there's a lot of research on the synthetic side, and that's also can lead to this discrepancy.
Okay, thank you. So just to follow up one more question. In your opinion, so why the protein upper level is not yet set? Because there are several studies already saying there is a positive association between the protein intake and the later BMI increase.
This is looking at kids. So it's still early days. These two papers, the data I just showed you now, is under review. There's data from infants, which is quite extensive, and they've done clinical trials. But in healthy kids of this age group, there's very little research in terms of that. So this is the first paper to do this association at that age group. But again, it's not causality, it's not cause and effect. And when you have the protein, you're also eating something else. For instance, if you have animal protein, and I say I get it from lamb, there's also saturated fats, there's many different things, which is very different to just eating chicken. You know, the fat content is very different. So is it entirely protein driven? No, it's not. So we need to really tease out these effects. So you need clinical trials to bring this cause and effect before you can start setting recommendations and upper limits.
First, Dr. Hardincha, and then Dr. Gibney, and then Dr. Allison.
Yes, thank you, moderator. Thank you, Leo. It's very interesting and a new thing for me. It was this science on the new protein science. If I would like to have more muscle, which one better? I do my exercise and breakfast immediately, or I do my exercise and dinner immediately. Thank you.
Well, that's a very, very difficult question to answer. The one thing that you should do is eat after your exercise. So whether it's breakfast or dinner, it depends. Assuming both are equal, so your nutrient component is the same at breakfast, the nutrient component is the same in the evening, then at this point I would say it's much, it's the same thing. There is, however, some evidence coming out on the metabolic responses of feeding different times of the day. And there is some work showing that if you eat beyond a certain time in the evening, the gene expression of genes responsible in fat storage actually increased compared to earlier on in the day. So there is this shift, and it's a field that we're currently working on, but we're not clear.
Thanks very much. I think we discussed this at another time, but your data was first for 9 hours, then 24 hours, and then a little bit longer. And in all instances, it shows that you can change nitrogen balance. And my issue would be, why would I want to do that in the longer term? I mean, if I was trying to be a weightlifter, maybe, but I'm an ordinary child playing football and netball and whatever you do. And I'm not too sure if I'm convinced that adaptation will not regulate down what you're talking about in the longer term. And I suppose a related issue is, you mentioned that the WHO's work is on, not on optimizing, it's minimizing losses. The question is, when you go to optimize, how do you define optimal? And that gets into really big difficulty here. So my question would be, what's the long-term issues, and how do you define optimal? I mean...
Sure. So, very, very valid points, and I'll try and address them in sequence. The first one is, it's, as I said before, it's not a long-term trial, right? So you have to start with identifying if this accrual occurs. The importance of this accrual is that, in essence, what you're accruing is metabolic tissue, active tissue. So glucose uptake, 70% of glucose uptake is taken up by the muscle, give or take. So increasing this lean tissue is very important for protecting you just from this, this long-term health aspect. You don't have to be a bodybuilder. What we're finding today is that you can get teenagers, they look very normal in their build, but they actually have huge amounts of fat deposition in their thighs. So this can be a huge problem when you start looking at pregnancy and diabetes during pregnancy, because they don't have enough lean tissue to start taking up this glucose. So it can be a very compromising situation. So kids are active, they can build, they are growing all the time, but we have to start looking at the ratios of protein, carbohydrate, fat to try and minimize any adipose accrual and maximize, because it's basically a very metabolic tissue. So that's the 2 points there, I believe. And then your third point, Mike, was? Two, okay. Well. So we do need long-term trials, definitely, because I'm not convinced that this happens, like kids don't grow every single day, right? So is it maybe targeting specific times of growth? But it's, as you said, it has to be convenient, and we can't think every day, is my child growing today, I'll feed it, I won't feed it. So giving protein, in addition to the carbohydrate, is important for this.
Thank you, Lan, for a great talk. I just wanted to make a comment that I think that sports nutrition companies have done a fabulous job in promoting rehydration after exercise with a focus on sugars and electrolytes, but they've completely missed the boat on protein. And I really wonder if you would think that milk would be a better recovery drink after exercise than sports nutrition drinks.
So we've actually done some of this work in the past in kids. There was some work showing that milk consumption after exercise is good for hydration, helps with hydration. We've done similar work in kids, and we saw that kids don't respond like the adults. They don't rehydrate to the same extent. So it depends, and then it depends what you start putting in the milk. And it depends how you define hydration, how it's actually measured. There are some studies out there that don't actually measure hydration. They just measure water retention, which is very different. So milk is a good recovery drink after exercise for sure. It does give you some of the liquid, but if you were pressed to get your whey protein shakes, milk is absolutely, it's great. It's just that you get your 7 grams in a glass. So if you really want to hit the maximal impact of 25 grams, you need to have 3 glasses of milk. So it's quite a bit.
But doesn't the time period go over 4 hours? So you could have your milk after your exercise and know that you will get the rest of the protein eating your normal meals.
Sure. The thing is, it depends on the intensity of the exercise. Sometimes it impacts appetite. So the last thing you want to be doing is consuming a lot of volume. It can be quite difficult. But sip on a glass of milk, or a liter in essence, or 750 ml of that over the 4-hour period. We did do some work at Nestle actually a couple of years ago, where we looked at the distribution of protein after physical activity, and it was better if you consumed 20 grams 3 hours apart over the next 8-hour window or something. Yeah.
I follow up on that just for interest's sake. I mean, I'm horrified to see the buckets of whey protein on sale in shops, in gyms, and everywhere else. And I see people in gyms walking around with their bucket of whey protein. It just, the mind boggles. This is the greatest rip-off I've ever heard of.
I'll take that as a comment. The evidence is there. It does work. It does stimulate protein synthesis. And we recently published a paper where you start looking at the exact types of protein. So it doesn't necessarily always lead to hypertrophy. There's long-term trials which show that, no hypertrophy, or there is hypertrophy. The jury's out on that. But what you do definitely get is an increase in the synthetic response in the muscle. And what those proteins are, like I showed on my first slide, it can impact enzymes, so enzyme production. That's also very important. So although you're not getting hypertrophy, you may be getting a more efficient muscle. So the muscle is working in a more efficient way. You've damaged it with your exercise, you've provided the protein, the substrate there, you've provided the energy, and now you can start rebuilding the muscle at a more efficient way, and also the enzymes involved in exercise metabolism.
I don't know how Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile before whey protein was discovered.
So imagine if he had consumed whey protein, right?
We have a question here from one of the delegates before I allow Dr. Allison to have this. Is there any effect on the renal function if we take high protein intake? I think this is a general question.
Sure. So I think there was a recent meta-analysis systematic review which showed there was no clear impact on that, a cause and effect. I've read papers showing there is, but also that the majority and a lot of key opinion leaders, when you're talking about healthy populations, not ones with compromised kidney function already. So if you're healthy, children, I don't know. I'm not aware of the literature there. But currently it seems that there is no impact on kidney function. But that's not to say that it doesn't impact it. So later on in life, when you start getting renal function issues, then it seems to be quite, it's an important factor to consider.
It's just a comment. It strikes me a little bit that we focus so much on milk protein, knowing that in infants, for example, it's been clearly shown that to a higher amount is actually related to obesity also in later childhood. So should we not focus far more on plant proteins and other sources of proteins, especially in countries where it's locally available, and make this more available to people, rather focus so much on milk protein?
Sure, I fully agree. And there's a lot of work happening on that. The problem is like was presented yesterday, taste is a very important aspect. Plant proteins for a lot of people don't taste nice. It depends, of course, what part of the world we're talking about. And then you have the aspect of soy protein. 94% or so goes to animal feed. It's such a waste when you do have it locally produced. But there's a stigma with soy protein of it being GMO. So that also keeps people away from it. There's been a lot of research done on soy protein. But when you start looking at other alternative proteins, less mainstream, there's very little work. But it is a field that's rising. I've seen a bit of literature coming out in recent times. But there's no clear direction showing that it's less unhealthy in terms of the outcome you showed. And we did a systematic review last year, actually, looking at plant versus animal source proteins on metabolic health outcomes. In kids, there was non-existent data. In adults, if you have an observational study, then it shows that the plant is better for these outcomes, but clinical trials don't support that. So it comes back to your question, Sophie, of, is it a cause and effect when you look at observational studies? It's not, because there's so many other factors included. But it's definitely a gap that we need to follow up in terms of sustainability as well. Yeah, definitely.
I think you alluded to the fact in one of your slides, the insulotropic effect of proteins. And I think this is something, in my humble view, has not been taken up much more systematically. Because in this era of people eating high GI diets, you know that certain proteins have an incredible ability to attenuate glycemic response by the co-ingestion of proteins. And it turns out, as the previous speaker commented, that the best effectors are not animal proteins, but actually they are plant proteins. Rice protein, pea protein, soya protein. So I just wonder whether this is an area that you or your group are planning to do the synthesis of insulotropic aspects of protein in relation to glycemia, because much of the mantra on protein has been on lean tissue accretion, blah, blah, blah. So I just wanted to comment.
I think it's an important area to look at. It's another gap. And this is what we talk about, is protein good? It depends for what. There's all these different aspects. The thing is you always have to look at the reciprocal glycemic response. So or should I say the insulinogenic response to the glycemia. If you don't have any glycemia, but you have a high insulin spike, then is that good or bad? The jury's out, but mainly they say it's not a good thing. So this is where we start looking at proteins as part of the diet, and it should be included more in the diet, not just as individual ingredient ingestions. But it's definitely an area that I think should be looked at.
While waiting for some delegates to still formulate their questions, I would like to take off from what my colleague earlier had mentioned, Dr. Makalintal, regarding the dilemma of our Filipino school children. They have to go to school at 6 a.m., some of them as late as 7 a.m. They have to wake up at 4 a.m. And that created a lot of short-order cook Filipino mothers. Three things: either they cook fried egg, they boil instant noodles, or they cook cured processed meats. So what kind of proteins are we giving our Filipino children?
So I guess you're asking which one of those would be the best one? Is that what you're asking?
Is it the devil or the deep blue sea or another devil lurking?
Well, the thing is, there's a lot of research, again, association studies with cured meats. It's very high in protein, right? But there's other side effects to it. A fried egg is 7 grams of protein, give or take. It's just what a normal and average egg has. Noodles, I'm not aware of the nutritional content of these noodles specifically, but I think something like an egg, and I'm Greek myself, and I know that's quite a big thing to give at breakfast to children, so it tends to be boiled, because you can store those in the fridge and you don't have to cook anything in the morning. So that would be, my take would be that would be the best one.
Which goes back to their question earlier, how about milk? You have alluded to earlier that it can provide somehow a good enough source of protein, but our dilemma here is our children does not anymore drink milk after like 2 or 3 years of age, unfortunately. So I think my colleagues here should encourage that particular breakfast fare.
Yeah, as long as it's done in moderation. We don't want to be replacing water with milk. Milk's a very important nutritional source, of course.
We still have 3 minutes. No more? Oh, Dr. Gibby.
Just for fun, I mean.
You know, I sit next to you.
The issue of the whey proteins and recovery, I mean, I get that. The biology is very, very strong. But isn't it about recovery? I mean, therefore, the question is, if you take the whey protein after the exercise, you speed up recovery. So if you're a tennis player or some other athlete that needs to be on the court again shortly, then this is a good thing. Now, if I'm a golfer, on the other hand, it may not be so urgent. And if I'm an ordinary person, will I not regenerate that slight depletion of nitrogen during the exercise easily during the day?
Yes. The short answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
It depends on the intensity you're talking about. So I run myself. Do I consume 25 grams of protein after each session? No, I don't. And sometimes not having anything after and exercising in a fasted state is actually more beneficial for a short amount of time. You get different adaptations occurring. So it all depends on, unfortunately, you can't turn back time. You can't say, I'm going to take the protein for 6 months, and then I'm going to turn back time and do exactly the same thing. And there's always inter-individual variations. So it depends on the intensity, what are you trying to achieve, and also one's mindset as well.
Dr. Panlilio.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture, Doctor. I would just like to know if there's a difference between the protein requirement of the male and the female for the children that we have because of the muscle content of the male adolescents.
So is your question, sorry, for adults or for adolescents?
For children.
For children, it's pretty much the same.
The same.
Yep.
So thank you. How about for adults?
Adults between males and females is the same, but you start getting differences during gestation. So the recommendations are slightly different there, if I'm not mistaken, yeah.
Any more questions or comments? So that I can give an additional 1 minute extra break time for those of you who missed on their protein. Thank you, Dr. Karagounis,
Thank you.